Thank you all for the invitation, and I will just get into it. This talk is a very condensed version of my thesis. So if there are more questions, I'm sure my thesis has covered them all, but I will tell you if you have any questions about it as well. So firstly, my thesis was a collaborative doctoral award, which is now collaborative doctoral project, I believe. And so was initially headed by the National Trust, who said, we have this collection, it has some connections to enslaved labour, can you help us, more or less? And I went from there, taking on the research and adapting my thesis from that one idea. What I don't talk about so much in this paper is the imperial connections as well, which I touch upon in the thesis as well, but the focus again is more on that enslaved labour in the history of the objects. So, so as I was saying, my research exists within a framework of materials laced together around the archival gaps left by the hostile archives. And this idea of the hostile archive developed from engaging with works such as Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives and Rebecca Hall's Wake. These works, which do not follow a traditional historiographical approach, identify the numerous issues with the sources that were deposited and maintained by institutions. Their works highlight how the archives have been antagonistic in regards to histories of enslaved people, and how the evidence that remains favours the archival system and people which oppress them. I've chosen to describe these archives as hostile as a method to emphasise the historiographical problems caused by systemic historical prejudices in archival development. These hostilities in the archive have created gaps in accessing narratives of enslaved people, which figures like Rebecca Hall and Christina Sharp mourn, exploring these histories of the Black experience as the act of a wake. Referring to the production of the archive as hostile is my acknowledgement of the processes which led to these particular historical gaps. Whilst the archive has been hostile to understanding the experiences of enslaved people, some of these narratives have been pieced together using the resources that have been left behind by the dominant planter society. And so I've reconnected the enslaved people's histories as one source of the Beckford's collection's history. And by exploring a selection of plantations under Beckford's ownership and by analysing working conditions and lived experiences of enslaved people. For many of Beckford's plantations, few archival details regarding their everyday exist, but using the surrounding information and some secondary works by other scholars, it is possible to build an analysis on how the plantations functioned and how those enslaved might have lived. And so, the Lucy family at Charlecote can date their lineage back to the 12th century. The original Tudor half-H house was completed in 1558, the same year that Queen Elizabeth ascended to the throne, and she visited the house for 2 nights in 1572. And so Charlecote Park, nestled on the banks of the river, looking out upon the parklands of deer and sheep in the early 19th century, evokes the image of Warwickshire as an idyllic place where tenant farmers worked and cared for the land in splendid isolation from the rest of the growing industrializing and connected country. However, the image of a rural, isolated county focused on agriculture is not entirely accurate. The contents of this country house tells the story of a connected world. There is a list of goods in the kitchen from 1721, which includes sugar, mace, rice, Jordan almonds, indigo, and coffee, all produce which ties Charlecote to far-flung countries. By the time George Hammond Lucy inherited Charlecote in 1823, the house was already part of global history. George's inheritance gave him the opportunity and money to attend the Fonthill Abbey sale. It was from this sale that George bought a number of art objects from the collection of William Thomas Beckford, which further ties Charlecote Park to slavery and imperialism. The same year, he marries Mary Elizabeth Lucy, and together they refurbished Charlecote Park to reflect its Tudor past. The redesign of the house encompassed the objects from the Fonthill sale as part of the Lucy's overall aesthetic of English domesticity, which toned down the connections between slavery and imperialism. The lack of explicit connections has led to a disassociation between Charlecote and the histories of enslavement within the objects. And Fonthill Abbey has been the ostentatious home of William Thomas Beckford, and William Beckford was a 4th-generation planter and complete absentee enslaver. He inherited the entirety of the plantations that he came to own, and distinctly benefited from purchases made by earlier generations and the aggressive expansion plans of his father. It was this wealth that enabled Beckford to curate his collection, and Beckford's letters allude to his dependence on his enslaved labour, but rarely is that labour spoken aloud, which in turn quiets the connection between the enslaved people and the object's histories. So, Jane Crawford's story can be glimpsed in one of the conveyances drawn up when Beckford sold Harbourhead Plantation in 1822. Aged 28, she was a black Creole with 3 children under the age of 10. All her children are listed as mulatto. This listing reveals the sexual exploitation of black women whose enslaved status prevented them from enacting willing consent. For Jane Crawford, the father or fathers of her 3 children are unknown. They've all been given different surnames, but this is not necessarily indicative of their parentage. Jane may have experienced a situation closer to the more well-known instances of enslaved and enslaver relationships, like Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson in Virginia in the United States, or Fibber and Thomas Thistlewood at Breadnut Plantation in Westmoreland of Jamaica. These were relationships spanning years, where Sally and Fibber are noted as negotiating privileges or were able to enact refusals. Some argue that they were as consensual as possible within the deeper asymmetrical power relations in which they existed, perhaps even loving considering the circumstances. However, this point of view can be readily argued against because of the very nature of enslavement. As Saidiya Hartman highlights, the impossibility of consent and the struggle to mitigate the brutal constraints of captivity through an entitlement denied the captive the prerogative of refusal. The power enslaver-enslaved relationship is inherently unbalanced towards the enslaver who holds all the power. Thomas Thistlewood's diaries reveal the extent of the abuse that he inflicts as overseer and plantation owner. Therefore, for Jane, if her children are the result of one of these relationships, her actions of consent cannot be explicitly stated as willing, but instead, like many others in her situation, it was an opportunity to carve out a method of survival to minimize the violence that she may have experienced. Jane is like so many other unnamed enslaved black women who experienced violence, their voices missing from the narrative. As Hartman lays out in another of her works, what else is there to know? No one remembered her name or recorded the things she said, or observed that she refused to say anything at all. We stumble upon her in exorbitant circumstances that yield no picture of the everyday life, no pathways to her thoughts, no glimpse of the vulnerability of her face, or of what looking at such a face might demand. We only know what can be extrapolated from an analysis of the ledger borrowed from the world of her captors and masters applied to her, end quote. What is left of the memory of Jane in the ledger should not just be the violence that she experienced at the hands of someone who held power over her. These encounters were not the culmination of her life and would only serve to perpetuate the same narratives of enslavement if her life outside these encounters was not considered. Her own mother and 2 brothers were at Harbourhead, lending the possibility to imagine the familial bonds between them. And it is quite likely that Jane and her family either all lived together within the same house, as housing in Jamaica was based upon family size, or close together based on an extended family network. Her mother, Rosie Beckford, at age 61, likely would not have worked a labourer's job on the plantation, like fieldwork. Based upon the records of Beckford's plantations that list ages and jobs, it is likely that she would have been superannuated. Not that Rosie would have had the luxury to experience a retirement upon the plantation. Instead, it could have been that alongside other older women, she cared for the younger children, including her own grandchildren. For Jane, the comfort of her family could have been a significant aspect of her personhood, a method to disconnect from the hardships of enslavement with the violence she experienced. The crop accounts held at the Spanish Town Archives provide a vital guide on the production of William Beckford's wealth. By just focusing exclusively on the shipments to England and only on the number of hogsheads shipped, an idea of the profits can be made. Whilst there is not always data available for every plantation in every year, the vast extent of sugar production on Beckford's estate is seen. The accompanying chart shows the shipment from 1782 to 1804, and the results of this graph suggest that the entirety of Beckford's plantations would typically ship over 1,000 hogsheads of sugar a year. And it is possible to show that the approximate valuation of the sugar shipped to England from Beckford's plantations in 1798 was £95,992. This doesn't take into account all the expenses that would have had to be paid for or anything like that. Beckford used his wealth extensively for self-fashioning, all which was made possible by enslaved labour. Although Beckford made his wealth from exploitation in the West Indies, the coloniality of his life was, as Donna Landry stated, quote, resolutely facing eastward rather than westward, end quote, in the distinct form of fiction and fantasy based within Orientalism. Beckford's eastward-looking fantasy also existed as a means of distancing himself from his involvement with slavery, which blurs the lines between the intentional and unintentional acts of quieting his connections to enslaved labour. However, Beckford's letters reveal his reliance on enslaved labour. In them, he continuously references his financial ties to Jamaica, which highlight his awareness and engagement with slavery, even though explicit references to that enslaved labour are rare. The letters quiet the importance of enslaved labour to his wealth, and therefore his art collection, but still show the connections between the Asian objects that he purchased in the display at Fonthill and the people forced to work on his plantations in Jamaica. Simon Gikandi has highlighted the links between slavery and the culture of taste and states, slaveholders were the major patrons of the culture of taste in their times. Without the massive profits made in sugar production in the Caribbean, conspicuous consumption would not have been possible, end quote. Gikandi's work revolves around the idea that the institution of slavery and the culture of taste are intrinsically linked in theory and in practice, and even uses Beckford as a case study to show this. For Gikandi, Beckford was continually evading trauma in attempts to define himself. Quote, the fact that he was oppressed by the constant reminder that his sense of self as a modern subject was built on fortunes made in the complex of sugar and slaves, end quote. Gikandi highlights that Beckford was driven by self-fashioning with the aim to disconnect his links to slavery. Beckford's Orientalist fantasy was arguably a conscious effort to overshadow the connections between enslaved labour and his self-fashioning. If a deliberate action, the private letters which feature Jamaica and his plantations prove that despite his attempts, Beckford could not escape his connection to slavery. Fonthill Abbey, built from 1796 to 1813 in Wiltshire, serves as the stage for Beckford's fantasy, a spectacle to contain more spectacles, curated to symbolise Beckford as a refined collector with taste. Whilst he collected all manner of objects, from silverware to fine art to books, he curated a particularly Asian fantasy through Chinese porcelain and Japanese lacquer. Including such wares throughout the Abbey was a keenly considered act that augmented the Gothic features of the Abbey by hybridising Asia with the older European elements of Gothic architecture and heightened the fantastical nature of the space. To understand the Abbey as a stage for the objects, we must analyse its construction. Perhaps the most famous indication of how the Abbey's construction began in Beckford's imagination comes from an essay which, with no title given, Boyd Alexander, who is one of Beckford's main biographers, names it Fonthill Foreshadow, but is also known as the Transport of Pleasures. Written at the age of 17, Beckford's extended 32-page fantasy is the intellectual groundwork for the Abbey, and is constructed in the essay, particularly in moments where the interior is described as the painted windows of a hall high above the tower will gleam with the light of many tapers and summon us to our evening's repast. We shall ascend the 100 steps which lead to the spacious hall wainscoted with cedar, whose arched roof will be strangely sculptured with Gothic devices. Above the window and below the others is a broad and ample gallery enclosed with gilt lattices and supported by thin pillars fretted with scrupulous dexterity. The doors of old oak are large and folded, and the huge chimney, useless in this season, will be placed grotesque vases of antique china filled with tube roses on the gallery. You will find stout coffers of cedar whose laborious carvings will amuse you for some moments. The imagery is already becoming clear. There was a vast, intricate design with lighting as a key aspect to the visual structure of the space, and the sense of physical space is evoked by 100 steps, arched roof, and broad and ample gallery, which conjures a place designed to awe. Notably, the vases of antique china, which are central to the room by their display in the chimney, are described as grotesque. Beckford was likely thinking of vases that depict distorted images of animals or people, but were intended to hold delicate flowers. And it is interesting to consider that antique chinaware was a significant part of this fantasy, where it appears that Asian influence was already a deliberate part of Beckford's designs for his building. A second room, twinned with the first great hall, is detailed in the essay, discovered through a secret door, the appearance of which is so strange and exotic that you will pause at the entrance for some moments and question yourself whether you are still under the influence of a dream. This room is decorated in all manner of Eastern wares. a room filled with the scent of jasmine and pineapples and finest mats from Japan. Cabinets sit in niches containing the rarest and most ancient Japan, and vases of porcelain esteemed even in China. There are Chinese drawings, variegated marble, and Japanese tables as well. These descriptions are a clear sign that from a young age, Beckford was interested in Asian art objects. Yet whilst the two spaces in the tower joined, symbolically suggesting the unity of Eastern and Western themes, the novelty of Asian designs is at the forefront of this section of the essay. Beckford sees this apartment as a place to retreat in solitude with his teacher, Alexander Cousins, and banish every anxiety and wholly abandon to the suggestions of our fantasy. It serves as an otherworldly space and time for escapism, but appears to be set within a frame of reality. In 1787, Beckford was sent to Jamaica by his lawyer, Thomas Waldman, who, alongside his brothers, managed his Jamaican affairs. Beckford wrote a few letters to his friend and former tutor, John Lettice, whilst he waited at Falmouth to go to Jamaica. The delay was caused by a lack of wind, and Beckford complained about the seasickness that he would ultimately feel on the journey. Whilst waiting, he received a newspaper from New York, which he stated gave a paragraph detailing a hurricane in Jamaica, and, quote, the destruction of half of Kingston by an earthquake, and several other particulars equally cheerful and interesting, end quote. Beckford's sarcasm was part of his stream of consciousness, continually despairing at the thought of spending a year or two in Jamaica. Earlier in the same letter, it is possible to infer his own opinions on the enslaved people of the island, where he stated that, quote, I would give 1,000 Negroes to be restored to the Cascades of Mallory, end quote. The correspondence between Beckford and his agents highlights how Jamaica sits under the surface of Beckford's life events. Wealth from his plantations facilitated his lifestyle, including time spent in Portugal and France, building the Gothic structure of Fonthill Abbey and filling the abbey with an extensive collection of art objects, which pulled focus away from the source of his wealth. The prospect of visiting Jamaica was too much to handle, the climate considered too unbearable, and waiting at Falmouth showed a glimpse of how he perceived enslaved people. Letters from Thomas Waldman talking about Beckford's finances, but not necessarily to Beckford, have highlighted the constant management of his estates without his involvement. The glimpse of his attitude towards enslaved people and the way his finances were managed without much of his input suggests an intentional disconnect from the enslaved labour from which he directly benefited and which would be quieted in the histories of the objects. In January 1790, Beckford had written to Lady Craven, one of my new estates in Jamaica brought me home £7,000 last year more than usual, so I'm growing rich and mean to build towers. The letter highlights how enslaved labour in Jamaica created wealth which facilitated Beckford's plan for curating art, and importantly, that he directly relied on money from the plantations to do so, but that labour is quieted in his wording. In a letter written in 1794 to James Wyatt's architect, Beckford once again notes his association with Jamaica and wealth. Mr. Waldman, having inspired me with such terror of laying out money and such apprehension of ruin, that I have constantly the fear of 600,000 emancipated black, yellow, and Mexican French slaves before my eyes. Beckford's letter most likely references the Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791. In 1793, France had declared war on Britain, which led to the invasions from opposing armies across the islands of British and French Caribbean. The fear amongst white people involved the subjugation of black people on plantations elsewhere in the Caribbean. The events in Haiti would inspire similar uprisings. Waldman was suggesting that Beckford should be cautious with his money, as the outcome of events were uncertain. It is illuminating how Beckford was forced to confront the realities of enslaved people when his way of living was threatened. Yet his phrasing of Mexican acts as a form of objectification, as an insulting phrase to describe people with one black and one white parent. It serves as a deliberate method of dehumanization, which is one of the processes of disconnecting enslaved labour from the object's histories. The indication of Beckford's wealth provides a context for his time in Paris, where his collecting and Jamaican plantations become even more heavily intertwined. The most prominent feature of this era in Paris was the Duc de Bouillon sale. The Duke survived the collapse of the Ancien regime when the Duchy of Bouillon was taken from him. Though he managed to recover it in 1801, he auctioned much of his estate though he recovered it in 1800, he auctioned much of his estate in 1801, as he was required to pay off his debts. Through an agent, Beckford purchased 37 lots from the sale, a large number of which were lacquer pieces. Notably, this acquisition was a year before the sale of Beckford's Esher estate to Henry Wildman in 1802. According to Beckford's lawyer, the valuation of Esher was enough to liquidate Beckford's debts to Wildman, which was valued a month before the Duc de Bouillon's sale at just under £2,000 less than Esher's valuation of £88,200. This highlights the balancing act of Beckford's finances, where the total sum spent at the Duc de Bouillon sale was 8,841 francs. Beckford had been angling for the Duke's collection since 1797, writing to his agent Nicholas Williams, "You are in possession of my sentiments respecting the Bouillon collection. No pains should be spared to attempt getting hold of it. I am, in fact, still more anxious about the Japans than the pictures, and surely they might be parted with in a lump sum and for a good price which nobody else can or would give them. But these small trifling toys cannot be very precious in any eyes except such as are affected with the Japan mania in a violent, incurable degree." The can and would sum up Beckford entirely. He had such wealth from his plantations that would allow him to purchase the lacquer all at once. He was also perhaps one of the few people who continued to buy Japanese lacquer in such fervour at the end of the 18th century. This culminated in money from enslaved labour buying Beckford's East Asian aesthetic. The price drop of sugar at the turn of the century did not factor into his desire for continuing his lacquer collection. And so, to interrupt Beckford's quieting of black enslaved labour, I will talk to you about Esher plantation. Some of the labour, so Esher is in St Mary's Parish, which is the north-eastish of the island. And I found two separate sources for Esher plantation dated in 1780 and 1789. The first is a list documenting William Beckford's assets at the end of 1780. There were 265 enslaved people on Esher plantation. The conveyance gives a list of ages and constitutions of the enslaved people surveyed by Alexander McLeod, the overseer. Most were able-bodied, but a few have been listed as weakly, distempered, or in the yaws, a tropical disease that affected the skin and joints. By the time of the 1789 schedule, 241 people were listed. 116 people were assigned as field workers, including people like Cyrus, Bessie, Barbara, and Dina. There was also Diana, a midwife, Dundee and Thomas, who made baskets, as well as carpenters, coopers, watchers, and people attending to the animals. Furthermore, there were 12 people marked down as useless and 22 in the estate's hospital, labelled the Negro House. It is possible to make comparisons between the two lists and follow lines of continuity for almost a decade. George was a carpenter in 1780, and by 1789, he was a head carpenter when he was aged 42. Michael Creighton notes that whilst skilled labourers were necessary for the function of the plantation, carpenters took on the widest variety of tasks and skills. It is possible that if George was Creole, a person born in the West Indian colonies, either from European or African descent, he would have first been an apprentice, learning from a young age before progressing in skill to head carpenter. Perhaps if he was African, he may have had a similar set of skills before he was forcibly taken from his home. Interestingly, from the 1780 list, there is no head carpenter listed, suggesting that George was perhaps already functioning within that role in everything but name. As head carpenter, George would have been responsible for the upkeep of the buildings and structures on the plantation, including the living quarters and carts. Creighton's work on Worthy Park plantation reveals that carpenters like George would likely have had access to their own tool shed and workshop. The highly skilled nature of George's work and the other carpenters safeguarded the functioning of the whole plantation system, ensuring that buildings and operations were maintained. George and the other skilled craftsmen highlight the massive workplace infrastructure required to run a sugar estate. Nevertheless, Beckford's financial strain became too great, leading to the sale of Fonthill Abbey and his collection. It was an opportunity for George Lucy to initiate his own collection, a way to obtain, at a reduced rate, objects that would have been widely accepted as choice pieces. The objects at the Fonthill Abbey sale are arguably representative of the shared taste sought by the landed gentry. Christopher Hussey characterises the late Georgian era as a time for mixing of styles and the precursor of the Victorian craze for collecting antiques. Susan Pearce relates this to the era's romantic collections that took a material form for the enhancement of the individual. She states that, quote, "The desire to extend sensation took some collectors to the exotic," end quote. For example, the art objects from East Asia, which were seen in Beckford's collection and George IV's continued collection, porcelains. Furthermore, Pearce continues that there was a desire to achieve experience. Quote, objects which were already seen to be true relics by reason of their real relationship with past people and events were transformed by the romantic eye into a sensation of knowing the past, of resurrecting the body of the past intact so that it might be experienced in the present. End quote. George Lucy's choice in purchasing these East Asian objects reflects these values. They represent a sensational exoticism while simultaneously connecting to a sensational past through previous eras and collectors. Taste is, of course, a nebulous property determined by the social hierarchies and conventions in place. But for George Lucy and early 19th century landed gentry more generally, tastes were, quote, taste was critically important in distinguishing those of rank and breeding from the rest of society, end quote, and in some instances for the sole purposes of expenditure. Lucy was able to develop an individual style based on the concept of Charlecote's longevity, whilst maintaining the early 19th century's taste for the exotic in the form of his new collection, and simultaneously a national homely aesthetic in the form of his very English style ancestral home. No longer part of Beckford's Eastern Gothic fantasy and directly connected to the plantations in Jamaica and the enslaved labour of Black individuals, instead they became part of George Lucy's redesign of Charlecote. The objects became an accepted part of the interior, designed with English history at its centre. The objects were placed throughout the house as display pieces and were some of the earliest collector's items to represent George Lucy's actions as a collector. Collecting became a prominent feature of George Lucy's life after the Fonthill auction, and the Beckford objects speak to the image which George Lucy perhaps intended to build. It was not until 1829 that George and Mary Elizabeth Lucy began, as Clive Wainwright puts it, to re-edify Charlecote. Wainwright clarifies this as the transformation of, quote, an ancient and decayed structure into a sound and modern one, which was at one at the same time decorated and furnished in an appropriately ancient style, but capable of functioning as a comfortable family house, end quote. George Lucy's aim was to re-emphasize the Tudor origin of their house. They sought a Tudor style before the Tudor revival reached the height of its popularity later in the 19th century. Wainwright emphasizes that the Lucys did not create an accurate reproduction of Charlecote's Tudor glory, but instead constructed a homage to its original roots, whilst also including more modern features in keeping with early 19th century lifestyles and social expectations. The rebuilding of Charlecote in the 19th century took place in two phases. First, George Lucy began with the new service port in 1829. The major development in this phase was between 1833 and 1837 and included the renovation of the Great Hall and the building of the western extension of the house to accommodate the library and dining room. The Great Hall was completely redesigned in the Elizabethan revival fashion, and the old minstrel gallery was removed, as well as the non-functioning organ. The ceiling was changed to a flattened barrel vault with plaster made to imitate timber. The chimney piece, which appears to be originally Elizabethan, is also a 19th century reproduction. The stained glass was repaired and re-leaded by Thomas Wilmot, a heraldic artist who had been appointed to George IV and who continued the Lucy genealogical sequence from the original 16th century glass. George Lucy's focus on lineage may have been because he was not a direct descendant within the Lucy line. Emphasizing the lineage so prominently served to represent the longevity of the family. And it also perhaps showed a clear distinction from the increased number of new rich families who had made their wealth from slavery from the East India Company. The dining room and library formed the west extension and looked out over the River Avon. The design of these also headed by Wilmot, who decorated the dining room with brown, red, blue, and gold flock wallpaper. Every effort was made to ensure that Charlecote could serve as the country seat of a gentry family that wished to emphasize its traditional, if not romanticized, English history. For George and Mary Elizabeth Lucy, the Beckford objects are no longer used for creating an Eastern fantasy, but for creating a space as a shared home, whilst also serving as signifiers with the social space of 19th century country houses, where the ideas of possessing unattainable masterpieces grew to show a difference from the developing mass manufacture of the Industrial Revolution. George Lucy embraced the East Asian objects from Fonthill, as Beckford was considered to be an individual of the finest possible taste, both in manner of literature and in virtue, and set them within the Elizabethan setting of Charlecote, ahead of the Victorian Tudor revival. With the objects from the Fonthill auction, George Lucy was able to develop Charlecote as a site of artistic expression and knowledge, but through a desire to express taste and knowledge, the other histories, the enslaved labour of the objects, became quieted. Beckford had successfully created his Gothic Orientalist fantasy to quiet the connections to enslaved labour in the history of the objects, and this layer of quieting remained with the objects as they were sold at auction. The Orientalist fantasy fulfilled Beckford's desire to focus attention away from the wealth source of the objects onto his qualities as a connoisseur of arts. George Lucy purchased the objects because of their quality and their relationship to Beckford, but unintentionally carried these layers of quieting with the objects, which over time led the objects' histories to become disconnected from that enslaved labour in Jamaica. George Lucy had no connection to the processes of enslaved labour that were part of the histories of the objects. His actions of buying the pieces for his personal display of taste and knowledge were not done to intentionally quiet the histories of the objects. However, his purchases did bring those histories to Charlecote. Through these histories, though these histories were now under the surface of Beckford's influence. George Lucy's choice in objects instead speak to what he considered valuable in the properties of the objects and as their symbolism for expressing his own wealth and taste. Dann, a bricklayer, was enslaved on Draxhall plantation. He was 23 at the beginning of 1780 and was noted as a mulatto. But more importantly, his condition was written as one of his legs taken off for theft. Such punishments were not especially unusual in the plantation system. As James Walvin points out, to keep slaves at the back-breaking, laborious work, overseers applied a tough and unbending regime. A skilled worker on the plantation, Dann would perhaps have been able to receive some of the benefits afforded to skilled workers, like the potential to earn money. Regardless of his purported crime, it was likely in an effort to maintain his livelihood and independence on the plantation, or as an act of defiance. Nevertheless, the punishment of disabling him displays the abusive authority at place at Draxhall, particularly as the loss of his leg likely prevented him from continuing his role as bricklayer, costing the freedoms that this afforded. The effect of his amputation was proved in the 1781 list, where Dann is labelled as a watchman, the role reserved for sick and invalid men. However, these lists are not the last instance where we find Dann. He is the subject of a paid advertisement placed by the overseer of Draxhall for runaways in the Cornwall Chronicle in 1783. Escaped out of the prison of this parish sometime in February last, a mulatto man slave named Dann, under sentence of transportation, formerly belonging to Draxhall Estate, the property of William Beckford, Esquire. He is a stout man, about 28 years of age, and has a wooden leg. Is supposed to be harboured on some of Mr. Beckford's properties, and was lately seen on the said estate. He is a dangerous fellow, goes armed, and is supposed to have stolen 2 horses since he made his escape. He had his leg cut off for robbing the late Mr. John MacDonald, the overseer of Draxhall. Information has been received that since his escape, he uses a neat cork leg and wears trousers. Any person apprehending said fellow and lodging him in any of the jails of this island, or will bring him to the subscriber, shall receive £10 reward. Advertisements from freedom seekers followed the general pattern seen in Dann's. A location, description, the alleged crime, and also whether the person was considered a threat. The description for Dann presents him as dangerous and violent, emphasising that he is armed and cementing his violent nature by stating his crime of robbing the previous overseer. However, a counter-reading can be applied to Dann's actions upon the plantations that take account of his circumstances as enslaved. It is not clear what he took from John MacDonald. It may be worth some monetary value which he intended to sell. Perhaps instead it was theft for better food. Or perhaps no criminal act had been committed at all. Either way, his freedom-seeking would have been a clear defiance of authority that, from the perspective of the white overseer, necessitated harsh punishment. The loss of his leg was not enough to discourage Dann's resistance, even after he was set as a watchman in 1781. He appears to have committed further transgressions to the extent that he wound up in the parish jail. Dann's actions can certainly be considered as acts of resistance. The sighting of Dann on the estate and the apparent fact that he was being harboured suggests that other enslaved people on the plantations did not consider him to be as dangerous as the advertisement would suggest. In providing shelter, they too were taking part in this resistance to enslavement, and even though they put themselves at risk, they show a strength of community. The billiard room and Japanese lacquer at Charlecote Park. George Lucy died in 1845. But the first instance of when we know where the objects were displayed is in Mary Elizabeth's biography of the Lucy family, published in 1862. The lacquer objects were described as all the Japan on the old Japan table in the billiard room was bought at Fonthill and came from the collection of the Duchess of Mazarin. Mary Elizabeth is generalizing about the lacquer collection. Only 2 identical lots, these bottom 2 here, are explicitly stated to have come from the Duchess, and 2 more from the collection of the Duc de Bouillon. It is possible that Mary Elizabeth believed all the lacquer to be from the Duchess of Mazarin. Such a provenance would have guaranteed that they would have been of exceptional quality. Japanese lacquer was one of the methods that Europeans were able to envision the country of Japan. The Tokugawa shogunate had closed Japan from 1635 to 1853, prohibiting Japanese people from leaving and severely restricting foreign trade to China and the Netherlands. The French were significantly interested in Japanese lacquer, where French rulers used lacquer as important demonstrations of political meaning and global engagement. Figures like, and I cannot pronounce Polish names, I believe it's Leszczyńska, Queen of France and wife of Louis XV, Madame du Pompadour and Marie Antoinette were committed to large collections of lacquer, which Christina Cluton notes indicate a degree of ruling power. The royal lacquer collections were significantly prominent because after 1693, the Dutch East India Company ceased imports of large lacquer pieces, in part because of shogunate restrictions and a decrease in quality caused by increased demand. The result of this was the development of imitation lacquer in France and English Japanning. Therefore, the finest pieces of lacquer from the initial Dutch imports from the early 17th century, which were of much higher quality. The royal and aristocratic collections were significantly important amongst collectors after the Ancien regime, which often held these high-quality pieces, such as the Mazarin chest and Van Diemen box, Mazarin chest, which can still be seen in the V&A today. William Beckford, with an interest in French culture and East Asian art, had a taste in Japanese lacquer, which was driven as much by the quality and rarity of such items as by their illustrious French provenances. The Duc de Bouillon was a great-nephew of the Duchess of Mazarin, which was why the Mazarin chest was in his possession before Beckford purchased it. The provenance of the items from this sale are not given for individual items, but the aristocratic connections to the Duke and the potential that some came from the Duchess of Mazarin and even Madame du Pompadour would have been part of the significance for Beckford. Similarly, for George Lucy, the royal and aristocratic connections would have likely been an important element of this purchase. Nevertheless, the provenance of lacquer was important to Beckford and likely important for George Lucy, and therefore would have been a significant point of pride for Mary Elizabeth when writing the biography of the family. The 2 identical boxes from the Duchess are fully gold takamahi. They are formed of 2 layers with a lid, sitting within a stand with curved feet. The stand is decorated with black and gold mahi, with birds, irises, and peonies, symbols of wisdom and honor. The boxes depict landscapes with buildings atop hills, with rivers flowing past, raised above the background. The buildings are set amongst prunus trees and foliage. The inside is decorated with nashiji or pearskin lacquer. George Lucy paid £9, 10 shillings and 6pence, and £8, 18 shillings and 6pence for these 2 boxes. The 2 identified boxes from the Duc de Bouillon sale are hand-sized. One is oval-shaped and the other is lobe-shaped. The oval box depicts purses and fans, whilst the lobe-shaped box is decorated with sacred peaches, a symbol of immortality. It is most often difficult to accurately follow provenance of smaller lacquer pieces based on the non-specific descriptions given to the objects in auctions and inventories. However, these 2 can be more accurately identified in the listings from Beckford's agent from the Duc de Bouillon sale as lots 16 and 17, given the descriptions of purses and flowers and the small accompanying outlines of the boxes. Beckford paid an interest to Japanese and Chinese literature and poetry, which suggests he may have had an understanding of the symbolic meanings shown on the lacquer boxes. However, the same cannot be said for George Lucy. His interest in these Japanese lacquer pieces appears to only extend as far as their purchase from the auction. No further lacquer pieces have been identified as bought after the Fonthill auction, with the exception of the lacquer table that these boxes were displayed on. Although it's unclear where this table is actually purchased from, I have not been able to source that. It suggests that George Lucy and therefore Mary Elizabeth were unaware of these symbols, and they formed part of George Lucy's initial phase of curatorship for Charlecote, and arguably chosen because of Beckford's own keen interest in lacquerware. The lacquer collection serves as objects for fashioning notions of superiority through objects based on the way these objects were viewed for their provenance and history as exotic pieces. Now, if we consider the billiard room as a place for entertainment, where men in particular would gather, play games, drink, and smoke, the golden lacquer gathered on the table, catching the light of the lamps to be admired and passing, perhaps containing pieces for games. However, thinking back to northern Jamaica, Isha Plantation produced 212 hogsheads of sugar in 1800, the year before the Duc de Bouillon sale, where Beckford purchased the objects. There is a list of names of enslaved people on Isha Plantation, and we know that Bessie, who was aged 1 in 1781 and extremely likely to have been born on the plantation, was learning to work in 1789. By the time the Duc de Bouillon sale in 1801, she would have been working on the plantation, likely in the field. Her forced contribution to Beckford's wealth is just one of over 1,000 from all of Beckford's plantations, but her labour and every other person on Isha was subsequently sold to Henry Wildman, and they can be considered to have directly contributed to the purchase of these boxes. So, as I will repeat what Michelle Rolfe-Trio stated, any historical narrative is a particular bundle of sciences, the result of a unique process, and the operation required to deconstruct these sciences will vary accordingly. These silences are produced from the sources themselves, and these lacquer boxes represent unquieting these histories of enslaved labour. These narratives are not entirely gone. Instead, they have been lessened over time, or quieted through a variety of means. George Lucy's role in concealing enslaved labour in the objects' histories was arguably not intentional as an indirect inheritor of the objects and their histories. Nonetheless, he and Mary Elizabeth quieted these histories through their recontextualization of these objects in an Elizabethan-inspired display. William Beckford's role in quieting is perhaps more complex, as the individual directly benefiting from enslaved labour. His acts of quieting are turned inward rather than an outward disavowal or of direct doers. His letters provide a glimpse at the ways in which he quieted the connection between enslaved labour and the collection. They indicate the need for money, but dehumanize the people involved in creating that money, thus quieting the enslaved labour held within the objects. Further quieting is enacted by the transition of the objects from one site to another, and then further quieted by historians who only speak of Beckford's wealth coming from plantations, rather than considering the labour on these plantations. But today, we can remember people like Bessie. And the work is being done at Charlecote Park to bring these narratives forward. This is one of the porcelain things that I haven't talked about today, but it's an ongoing process which we've been working together to unquiet these histories. Thank you.